morning, gentlemen. A lot of people have asked me what's going to happen in Ukraine. Is it the first step to the destruction of the world? Well, there's no simple answer to this question, and I will give you a historical perspective of what is likely to happen. It's not something so simple, to be honest, because the Ukraine crisis basically, if you look at it, is a creation of the West, in particular the United States. This is the first thing we must remember. Now, it all happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 92. At that time, the Americans thought we are going to be the number one power in the world with not a little help from China because they considered at that time China to be a friendly rival, not an enemy. The enemy was only Russia. But Russia, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, was weak. It didn't have any strength. Till the arrival of Vladimir Putin, and he had grandiose schemes to make Russia back into a global power. That's the point which really comes down to. And this is where the Americans had a rethink in their strategy. Bill Clinton, if you all remember, in 92 had promised Yeltsin that they would not expand NATO to the eastern borders of Russia to those countries which were part of the Russian sphere of influence or were members of the Warsaw Pact. That's a fact. But then slowly, once Putin came into power, they began to move eastwards. Poland, Romania, and others in the Baltic states slowly became members of NATO. And then the last bastion, and that was a very big one, was Ukraine. The Americans were keen that Ukraine should become a frontline state against Russia because they wanted to destroy Russia as an emerging power. It could be a unipolar world with only America as the king. For this purpose, from 2008 onwards, they made a plan to incorporate Ukraine into the EU as well as into NATO. The idea was to make it a front-line state against Russia and then somehow or the other sap the Russian economy. One, break Russia up into further parts, smaller parts, so that once for all, forever, Russia is finished and the West and America will rule the roost. Now, this is a point which has to be studied in detail. This was the American plan. And the Russians were not going to allow it because Putin knew that once Ukraine goes into NATO, it becomes an essentialist threat to Russia. So he sent a letter to the Secretary General of NATO saying that he should be given an assurance that Ukraine will not become part of NATO or the EU. Now, at that time, Joe Biden had taken over as president, and he was a man with a limited horizon, I will say, because if he had horizon, he would not have got embroiled in the Ukraine conflict, which can very well destroy America. I will explain how. His reply was very simple that these points are of for no meaning, non negotiable, no point of any discussion. That means he rejected the requests of the Russians and Vladimir Putin. In such a circumstances, what was Putin going to do? Ukraine was being built up as a bastion, and once NATO had reached Ukraine, it was on the cards that they would have tried to destabilize Russia further and try to break it into smaller pieces, countries. In such a situation, in 2014, he had annexed the Crimea, but then Donald Trump became president. And once he became president, he had realized that NATO is an obsolete organization. the Americans were spending billions of dollars for nothing out of the American taxpayers' money. But unfortunately, he lost the election and Biden came in, and Biden brought in the old policies which were being followed by Obama and party. That is, treat Russia as an enemy, which Donald Trump was not doing. Now the situation became that though the Crimea had been occupied in 2014, the Americans had tacitly agreed that Crimea would remain with Russia. But once the other portions of Ukraine rebelled against the central authority in Kiev, and at the same time, the new president who came in Ukraine, Zelensky, thought he was a knight in shining armor. He would be a knight in shining armor who would lead the people forward, the Ukrainians forward, and ultimately be part of the bandwagon that would destroy Russia. The Americans were pretty confident that they would be successful after their catastrophic defeat in Afghanistan. They needed something to show to the world that, look, we are still the number one power. And this is the genesis of the conflict. Once Biden had rejected the Russian contentions that NATO will not join, Ukraine will not join NATO and EU, the die was cast, and the Russians invaded Ukraine. Now, this is where there's a twist to the tale, because the Russian army, all said and done, put in a very poor performance. They should have overrun Ukraine inside a month, 2 months at the most. But now, 9 months down the line, they have just captured about 20% of the territory, and the situation is not very happy or conducive. Both the Ukrainians and the Russians have suffered about 100,000 casualties, which is a lot of people who die or rendered hors de combat. But what is the more dangerous thing is that the Russians have not been able to win the war, and neither have they have lost it. The West has been building up Ukraine's military, but they never expected the Russians to expand the conflict and destroy the infrastructure of Ukraine, which the Russians have now done. And Russia has completely destroyed the Ukrainian infrastructure of power and transport. Of course, the Americans will help with some weaponry here and there, but that's about all. They will not be able to continue to help Ukraine as long as they want. So we have a very peculiar situation here as to what is going to happen next. Now, the Americans have decided to give the Patriot missiles also to Ukraine. That marks an escalation in the conflict. Certainly, it does. But people are forgetting one thing. With all the scenarios which I have studied, I do not see how Ukraine is going to win this war. There are American generals who are talking of winning and defeating Russia in Ukraine. It's not going to be a localized conflict, but we must remember that great powers, when they become desperate, they use nuclear weapons. Now, this is the crux of the issue. I'll give you an example. In 1945, in the late summer of 1945, Japan had been defeated by the United States. And the United States was contemplating an invasion of the Japanese homeland. But they balked at this when they realized the consequences, because in the battles in the earlier Japanese islands of Okinawa and other places, the Americans had suffered tremendous casualties, and they didn't want to repeat those casualties. And it was a decision taken to save American lives and the American war effort that the atomic bombs were used in Japan. Now, something similar could happen here. The Russians, in case they are defeated in Ukraine, could resort to a nuclear strike. What happens next? I have studied the reports of some American generals, and they have said if there is a nuclear strike on Ukraine, it does not mean that America will hit Ukraine with nuclear weapons. That is the point to note. Because if you hit America with Russia with nuclear weapons, because Ukraine has got no weapons, that means a marked escalation and a thermonuclear war between two world powers that could destroy America. The Russians will also be destroyed, but the American civilization, where the Russians have targeted almost 50 American cities, would be reduced to rubble. So, in case there is a nuclear strike by Russia, my opinion is the Americans are not going to resort to a nuclear strike on Russia. That is number one. Number two, what would be the West's reaction? NATO will probably get into the conflict and mount an all out conventional war on Russia. Now, Russia cannot fight a conventional war against the combined forces of NATO. And if that happens and the Russians start losing, it is a sure short recipe for a thermonuclear war. Either way, the West would like to abhor, somehow to avoid a nuclear war or a nuclear with Russia. At least America, I think, doesn't want a nuclear war with Russia. But if the Russians are pushed to the wall, great powers do resort to any tactics by which they can win. And Vladimir Putin is not going to allow defeat and show to the world that Russia has lost its great power status. Recently, somebody asked me a question: what if the Russians were tomorrow to invade Poland or Lithuania or something? Because if the Americans throw in the towel in Ukraine, agree with the Russian demands, though Ukraine not going to agree to them, like ceding large parts of their territory to Russia, including the Crimea. But what happens if the Americans agree for a peace and if the Russians invade Poland or, for that matter, any of the Baltic states? Now, in this case, these countries are part of NATO, and it is incumbent on the Americans to come and fight for these countries. Now, here also is a very big question. In case of a conventional war, and if the West pulverizes Russia from all sides, there is no guarantee that Russia will not use a nuclear strike. If they have been successful in Ukraine, they could use it in Poland and in Finland also. And that case, again, it is the loser would be the United States. Now, just examine the scenario which I've created. I mean, it's one of those things which we study in mathematics, the theory of probability, where NPR is the number of options which come. I carried out all the options and I can reach to only one conclusion, that somehow or the other, if the Americans do not make an adjustment in Ukraine with Russia, it could well lead to the destruction of the American state. If I was the Secretary of State in America, I would go around in a different way. I would almost agree to the Russian demands on Ukraine and forget about Ukraine. Living and developing your country, your people is much more important than fighting for an obscure country like Ukraine and trying to finish off Russia. Russia is too big a country to be finished off, and it has the most advanced thermonuclear weapons. I will remind people what Nikita Khrushchev had said in 1961. He had said all he needs is 5 to 6 thermonuclear bombs, and England would cease to exist on the world map. This is not an idle threat. I think Harold Macmillan was the prime minister at that time, and he was very worried. What if it became a reality? Now we are coming to the same situation here in Ukraine. The West has instigated the war. The Russians have not been able to win. The West is pumping up billions of dollars of weapons and other things into Ukraine. Russians have escalated. They have started destroying the infrastructure of Ukraine. In other words, reducing Ukraine to ruble, and no American help is going to stop that. But the American generals still thinking they can win the war, and so do the Ukrainians, and push the Russians out and defeat them, and then maybe finish Russia once for all. It's not going to happen that way. This is where the American thinking is fallacious, and it's necessary that Joe Biden is removed as the American president because he seems to be looking at the things in a different way. In any problem, there are many solutions. He's looking at one solution, but he doesn't see the consequences. A Russian defeat in Ukraine would mean that the Russians would use nuclear weapons. There's no option of it. And America will not retaliate with nuclear weapons, but with a conventional war. And once NATO and the US get involved in a conventional war with Russia, the next thing would be a nuclear conflagration because Russia cannot fight NATO and the Americans with the type of resources they have got. Now, Ukraine is the crucial issue here. As far as the president of Ukraine is concerned, Zelensky is very clear. He says, I want those territories which are with Russia taken back, and I should get a guarantee that our neutrality will be respected. Now, who's going to give that guarantee? There's, you don't expect China to give that guarantee. China doesn't have the resources. Russia won't, Ukrainians will not accept Russian guarantee. The only person who can give a guarantee is the United States. But that guarantee means that America will go to war for Ukraine's neutrality. I don't think America is ready to fight with Russia over Ukraine. This is my reading of the situation. They are hoping that they'll be able to win without their active involvement of their ground forces. It's unfortunately not going to happen because the next step is the nuclear option which Russia has. And a limited tactical nuclear strike is on the cards. And I can tell you, gentlemen, America is not going to respond with a nuclear strike on Russia. You do that, you destroy America for the next 100 years. You must remember the half-life period of a nuclei is 50 years. Nothing will grow in America for 50 years. It's a long time. So Joe Biden should be very, very wary. I would suggest one thing to Joe Biden, and too small a man, but I have a grasp of history, that he must make an accommodation with Russia on Ukraine. It's the old policy, live and let live. You will have to recognize that Russia is a great power. It's not something you can just go around and say, do this, do that. It's not that simple. And once that realization dawns, Zelensky is a very, very small fish. He will probably have to go. That means a regime change in Ukraine. Mark my words, gentlemen, in case the Americans are foolish enough to continue this war, I have already painted a very dismal scenario for them. America has lost every war it fought after 1945, and I don't see them winning in Ukraine and defeating the Russians there through their proxy, Ukraine. Not going to happen. If Ukraine was all that powerful, they would have pushed the Russians out of Ukraine by now. They have been able to do it. On the contrary, So many portions of the Donetsk region have been incorporated as part of Russia, and Russia is not going to give them ever. So you have to be a realistic man, realize what are the consequences, probably have Russia that territory, carry out a regime change in Ukraine, and have detente, which was there when Brezhnev was in power. You don't have it, you risk the destruction of your civilization. And I think Biden would be better off sometimes to go and do fishing with his grandchildren than to think on these lines because he's being led by some hawks in the military, and those hawks have an axe to grind. I hope, gentlemen, sanity will prevail over Ukraine. I have given an entirely different picture here. It's my assessment of the situation. Let's see what happens. Nobody can foretell the future. I am not an astrologer or a soothsayer. I close now, gentlemen, and hope all of you a jolly good time. If you like this video, subscribe to it and share it with your friends. Goodbye. Jai Hind. Glory to India.